Chapter 37, In Order. In order.
There, would you like any honey with it?
Asked Nalia gently, passing a bowl to the girl next to her, and Herdalis watched as Fritha shook her head.
No, thank you.
It was mid-morning and the group were sat about their usual table in the coronet taking breakfast, though the dark mood that hung over them would not have been out of place at a funeral supper. Herdalis let his gaze travel the table. Zuhara was staring absently out of the window next to her, while the nightling was putting all his attention into slowly eating his breakfast, a frown never far from his brow, and even his usually bright dove seemed to be under a cloud that morning. In fact, the only one who was still in his usual good spirits was Minsk, the ranger, watching his hamster steal food from his plate with a fond look, seemingly oblivious to the surrounding gloom. Herdalis glanced across the table to where Fritha was sat, pushing the porridge she had been served about her bowl, looking drawn and distracted, Nalia hovering anxiously at her arm. The previous evening had found them all bar one about that same table, Zuhara insisting that they wait for Fritha to arrive back from the playhouse before they took their meal. But the girl did not return, and eventually they ate without her, Mek arriving with the dusk bearing a message from her apologizing for the absence and asking if he, Herdalis, would return with the boy to the theater and, strangest of all, to bring his lyre. The boy would not tell him anything as they made their way back through the emptying streets, though it soon became clear as he arrived to find Fritha knelt upon the stage, sheaves of sheet music spread out about her, the ink on the one she held still wet. It seemed the musician Higold had hired to play the music along with the less experienced Marcus had disappeared, the man leaving the inn where he was staying and taking the score for the play with him. Fritha had, of course, been summoned, and after many wasted hours following leads about the city trying to find him, she had given the errant minstrel up as lost and sent for the tiefling. At first, Herdalis had joined her on the stage, and together they had attempted to write the score again from memory, while the cast about them tried to help, humming passages here and there and arguing, until Fritha seemed to decide this too was a lost cause and sent them back to their rehearsals, ushering himself and Marcus into a small narrow room, empty save for a huge gilt mirror. And there the three of them sat, a copy of the script before them, and using what Marcus could recall of the old score for a foundation as they composed a new one, the boy on his harp, while Herdalis had his lyre and Fritha played an old lute they had found in the props cupboard that was missing the last pair of strings, the remaining pegs so worn it had to be retuned after every song or so. But she played it very well and did not seem remotely shy for all her claims of being frightened of performing in front of others. He glanced to her again, Nalia and the girl holding a furtive conversation, though it seemed to be very one-sided, the young thief finally going back to her breakfast with a sigh. Fritha was clearly not in the mood to share whatever was wrong, and Herdalis let his mind drift back to his own concerns as his eyes fell on the girl next to him. Ari was being decidedly distant with him that morning, though he could not for all the plains understand why. In answering Fritha's summons he had been unable to attend the circus with the elf, and though when he had asked the girl at the time, she had said she did not mind, she was behaving very coolly towards him that morning, though whenever he questioned her she was still maintaining nothing was wrong. Ari glanced up to catch him watching, returning the smile he sent her wanly before dropping her attention back to her dish, and Herdalis frowned. Upset or not, he had asked her about it more than once now, and if she wasn't willing to tell him what was wrong, who was he to play psychic?
Fritha, are you even listening to me?
Came an exasperated cry from across the table, Fritha clearly glancing up just as he did and looking quite surprised as she came face to face with a very frustrated Nalia.
Goodness, where are you this morning?
Herdalis smirked slightly, ready to bring himself round with a little trouble.
Wherever she is, I think the druid is there as well. Come now, my ptarmigan, you have surely admired your reflection long enough for now.
Zuhara started at this address, turning from the window to send him a dark scowl.
I was wondering on our plans for the day. Unlike you, Bard, I am able to focus past the end of my own fine eyelashes. Oh, peace, you two!
Snapped Fritha with an abruptness that made Nalia start.
And as for our plans, we'll go and look at the bounties just as we do every time we set out to find work. Why must everything be such a battle?
Fritha walked at the back of the party alone, following the others as they made their way back from the council buildings. None of the bounties on display there had been suitable, and the overall mood of the group was low, something she knew had been little helped with her outburst at breakfast, though she was finding it difficult to care. As though her problems with Inomen and the theater weren't enough. That she and Herr Dallas had returned late the previous night was true, but she had not slept even once she had reached her bed, just lain awake watching a shaft of moonlight move across the ceiling as long-buried memories of Candlekeep swam behind her eyes. The discovery of the library had awoken something in her, something that had been better off forgotten, and for all her telling herself she would not return to that shrine to Ogma, her mind would give her no rest, constantly dwelling upon when she would have a spare moment to visit again.
Fritha!
Broke a voice through her thoughts, and she glanced up to find Nalia had dropped back to walk next to her, her hazel eyes watching her with a troubled look just as they had all morning.
Fritha, is something wrong? No, nothing.
Nalia paused, her air of concern unwavering, though a slight smile was now pulling at her mouth.
You sound like Ari,
she said quietly, and Fritha glanced ahead to where Herr Dallas and Ari were walking side by side, the bard looking mildly irritated as Ari took what seemed to be a very deliberate interest in the scenery as they went. Fritha laughed slightly.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to sulk.
But Nalia just shook her head.
I doubt that you or my aunt would always accuse me of such after we had argued, but as I would point out to her, it is only sulking if there is no real reason for your melancholy.
Fritha turned from her, letting her gaze travel over the grand houses and manors about them, the homes of Athkatla's higher-ranking nobles. Perhaps there was a reason for her melancholy, but it was hardly an exclusive one. Nalia too had lost her home and father, and the girl must have faced constant reminders of it as they moved about the city. Fritha sighed. Candlekeep was no more lost to her than it had been before the library's discovery, and Gorion had always said that home was not just the place but the people too. She glanced back to find Nalia still watching her, her eyes gentle.
You do not have to tell me what is wrong, I just want you to know that I will be here should you wish to. Thank you,
Fritha trailed off and smiled sheepishly.
I think I might have been sulking though.
Nalia laughed brightly, and Fritha felt suddenly warmed, more than ready to distract herself with some idle talk.
So, how was your evening yesterday? Did you get any more embroidery done on your new robes? Yes, a little, Here yeah, I bring grave tidings,
came a loud voice, and Fritha turned with the others to see a lean dark-haired youth jogging along the street toward them, calling as he went.
Here yeah, trade meat is under siege. Under siege?
Repeated Nalia, holding up a hand to stall him as he passed.
By whom? By the very creatures that once roamed peaceably about her forests, my lady.
Minsk looked instantly aghast.
Innocent animals are attacking the town. Oh, no, Boo says this does not sound right. Right or wrong, my lord, it is happening. It is as though nature herself has risen up against the town, and all eyes turn to the local sect of druids. Druids would never act so without provocation,
said Zuhara, looking affronted on their behalf, but the man just shrugged evenly.
I merely report the situation, my lady, I do not judge it. Well, if you will excuse me, I've to get this about the city by sundown.
Zuhara turned to face the group as the crier continued on his way.
Well, it seems we could have found our next task.
Minsk and Ari began to nod, but Nalia looked almost stricken.
Leave the city again so soon?
She exclaimed, and Fritha felt her stomach lurch.
But we have hardly exhausted all sources of work here yet.
Zuhara sent the girl a stern look.
We are in need of work, Nalia, and besides, we would do well to leave the city.
She glanced to Fritha and turned away again.
It stifles me. Well, it does not stifle the rest of us.
Nalia snapped, and looking as though she would continue before she was calmly cut off by the squire.
I must agree with Nalia. Many have surely heard this news, and trade meet is a fair distance. We could arrive in the town only to find the troubles already at an end.
Zuhara looked angry, though it seemed more at the wisdom of a gnome's argument than anything else.
Indeed, and what have you to say on the matter, Fritha?
Well, she began, very aware of Zuhara's eyes still boring into her as she stole a glance at Nalia. The girl had turned away from her, as though she did not want to influence her decision, but Fritha could tell she was unhappy. Fritha turned back to the others.
We'll stay in the city for a few more days yet and look for something local. But if we don't find anything by the 7th, we're heading out for trade meet before the weather worsens.
Zuhara snorted but said no more, and everyone else seemed happy enough with this decision. Fritha sighed.
Well, since we're staying here, we should continue looking for work. What of the order, a gnomon? And if we're wandering that way, we can ask about the temples as well.
A gnomon looked suddenly reluctant about having their whole group attending what was effectively his home, but there was little he could do now, and he turned to lead the way with good grace, Fritha following a pace or so behind him, Nalia at her side. It was approaching noon as they arrived at the temple district, the group making their way along the paths and bridges that spanned the canals to the Order's compound in the southeast. It was an impressive collection of sandstone buildings, a myriad of domes and towers just visible above the high poplar-lined walls, and Fritha could see why a gnomon was proud to number in their ranks. They skirted the outer wall, following the squire to the gatehouse, though not all was as she would have expected as they rounded the corner, a strange commotion on the path before the gates. A handsome young man was at the foot of the slope up to the gatehouse and seemingly trying to woo the petite young lady who was stood on guard at the mouth. Her plaid mail glinting in the sunlight, its shine was rivaled only by that of her pale blonde hair, which was cut to at least an inch above her collar and falling in neat feathery layers about her pretty face.
Oh, my fair Irlina, I am here to pledge to you the love of a poet and an artist. Take my fragile love, my sweet, and hold it tenderly to your heart. Helm's mercy, not that fool again,
sighed a gnomon with a clear dislike, continuing when Fritha glanced to him for an explanation.
That fop has been loitering about here for a month or more now and subjecting all who pass to this torment whenever the Lady Irlina is on guard duty. The woman has my deepest sympathies,
muttered Zuhara behind them, and Fritha nodded, giving little more thought to the matter. That was until the man turned and began to walk towards them, and she recognized just who it was. She gasped, glancing briefly to Zuhara for confirmation. Isn't that Garrick?
You know him?
Came a gnomon, looking disconcerted, and Fritha shrugged.
Well, yes, in passing. His bard mistress tried to kill us when we passed through Beargost in the spring. Garrick. Hey, Garrick!
She called, tripping lightly down the steps to meet him, Nalia and a gnomon both following at a more decorous pace as the others made to settle where they were and await their return.
Garrick!
The young bard now appeared to be in deep conversation with a clump of bushes that were nestled in amongst the poplars against the outer walls. Though he glanced up as she spoke, his blue eyes narrowed slightly.
Yes. Do I know you? I should think so.
Fritha laughed.
We met in Bergost, outside the Red Sheaf Inn. You were working for Silka at the time though, admittedly, not for much longer after we met her.
A paused to consider this and suddenly the lad was beaming.
Ah yes, I thought you looked familiar, so nice to see you again, Freya.
A gnome sighed deeply and disappeared through the gatehouse, clearly deciding the rest of this discourse would be a waste of his time, Nalia laughing into her sleeve as Fritha rolled her eyes.
It's Fritha, and why are you talking to a bush? I'm not, see,
he answered, pulling back one of the branches to reveal a well-dressed gnome, dark-haired and swarthy with a neat pointed beard and large crooked nose.
Well met, ladies, I am Cyrando,
he said, sweeping off his wide-brimmed hat and bowing so deeply the feathers brushed the ground. Fritha smiled, nodding her head in greeting as Garrick continued.
So how have you been, Fritha? I believe I left you with plans to visit the Nashkel mines, which we fulfilled. Then we traveled northwards, looking for a source to the iron crisis. Ended up in the gate of all places before we, came here. Yourself. I headed south a few days after you did, joined up with a troop that was part of the Nashkel fair. I traveled with them to where we separated, and I came to Athkatla with thoughts of getting passage to the moon chase when I was caught by Soon's fickle net. The Lady Irlina's noble beauty has stolen my heart, but alas, I did not even dare speak to her until Cyrando here agreed to help me. He has such a way with words, it is only now I feel I am getting close to showing her the depth of my regard.
Garrick shook his head, looking for a moment rueful.
He is a good friend, and I am a poor excuse for a bard. Come now, boy, cheer up,
said the gnome, clapping him heartily on the arm.
Now have you learned the last poem I wrote for you?
The youth nodded, pulling a sheaf of parchment from his pocket.
This is all very decent of you,
Nalia smiled, turning back to Cyrando as Garrick moved off again, hastily going over his notes as he went. The gnome's gaze followed him, his expression unreadable.
For all his faults when it comes to the more courtly arts, he has something I lack.
Cyrando glanced to them, looking resigned as he confirmed,
he is handsome by your standards, is he not?
Fritha glanced across to where Garrick had returned to his courting of Irlina. It looked as though Cyrando's poem was being well enough received, the woman blushing slightly as she pretended she could not hear him, though Fritha could tell by the stilted delivery that Garrick was having trouble remembering the words. There was no denying he was handsome, his smooth face earnest and ruddy beneath a neatly cropped head of warm brown curls. She glanced to the girl next to her and raised an eyebrow. Nalia shrugged mildly as though she didn't care much either way, and Fritha turned back to Cyrando with a smile.
I suppose a girl could do worse. Indeed,
he nodded,
and I see the conviction behind the nonchalance of your words. The boy is a god and I, regrettably, am not.
Fritha frowned slightly, feeling she was missing something here.
So you're helping Garrick to court Irlina because he's handsome?
Nalia sighed impatiently, giving Cyrando a sympathetic look.
Fritha, do not be so dense. You are in love with her as well, are you not, sir?
Cyrando nodded once, determined in his dejection.
It is so, my dear. I have loved the lady ever since I saw her at the theatre here a year or more past now. But I could never court her. The boy, Garrick, uses my words and, in a way, my heart is laid bare to her, I must be satisfied with that.
Frithha frowned slightly. Sad though the situation was, Sirando's broken heart was more due to his own reluctance than anyone else's doings, and by Nalia's look they were in agreement.
So you have not even told her of your feelings?
She confirmed slowly, to which the gnome nodded. Nalia folded her arms abruptly.
Well, that hardly seems fair. By not giving Irlina a choice you're making her decision for her.
Sirando looked rather taken aback.
But she would never. I am unworthy to be with such a beauty.
Frithha snorted.
What nonsense! Besides, she might not think so.
The girl continued evenly, and Nalia gave a nod.
You do the lady a discredit. You assume she is too shallow to consider anything beyond appearance in a suitor.
Sirando mouthed silently a moment, and Frithha felt rather sorry for him. This was clearly not the reaction he was used to receiving for his confessions of love unrequited.
No, you do not understand. Well, that is.
Frithha sent him what she hoped was a kind smile.
Well, either way, it doesn't seem like she's overly impressed with Garrick for all his looks, does it?
The three turned as one to look again at the pair. Irlina's blush now intensified to an uncomfortable scarlet as the bard walked up to the gatehouse and tried to take her hand. Sirando said nothing.
Frithha,
called a familiar voice, and she glanced up to see a gnome marching down the cobbled slope from the gates towards them, barely sparing the swain and his reluctant lady a glance.
Sir Ryan Troll would speak with us inside. Ah, duty calls,
Frithha smiled, giving a parting nod to the gnome next to her as she and Nalia made to join a gnome before the gates.
And remember, faint heart ne'er won fair maid.
But Irlina was not going to let this opportunity for distraction pass her by, it seemed, the woman glancing up to notice the squire, and a smile suddenly lit her face.
Greetings to you, Squire Gnome,
she called, at their side in but a few quick strides, and leaving Garrick to slope back to Sirando looking rather put out.
We have not seen you here in a while.
A gnome nodded, no less than beaming.
Indeed, Lady Irlina. And you are as fair as when I left, I see. It is a pleasure to hear the melodious tones of your voice once again.
Frithha gave a snort that she turned very hastily into a sneeze, Nalia next to her and fighting so hard against a grin it looked like she was chewing a toffee. A gnome turned to throw them both a scowl as Irlina continued.
So a gnome, how go your quests? Very well, my lady. We have only yesterday returned from Umar.
She smiled generously, her blue eyes shining.
Is that so? And these must be your companions.
A gnome nodded once, turning slightly to introduce them.
Indeed, this is Lady Nalia d'Arnis and Lady Frithha of Candlekeep. Hello,
the girls chorused brightly.
Well met,
Irlina responded, still smiling.
I hear you have been given the task of leading our squire here on the path to glory. Aye, for our sins,
agreed Frithha, shaking her head mournfully and sending a sly wink to a gnome. The three women laughed at his suddenly flushed complexion, though he was saved from any further embarrassment as Garrick chose that exact moment to return, a fresh poem in hand, and Frithha and a gnome left Nalia and Irlina to suffer alone, passing under the shadow of the gatehouse and into the courtyard beyond. Inside the walls, a large paved yard was laid out before her, a scattering of knights and squires milling about it engaged in various tasks, and some nodded greetings to a gnome as they passed. He appeared to be headed for the huge stone hall that was stood opposite the gates, and Frithha let her attention drift to the other buildings as they moved across the square, a blacksmith's forge and stables to her right, while what she assumed were the dormitories and refectory were in a long tall building on her left. the smell of cooking floating from the open windows.
"Ho, a gnome!"
called a voice, and Fritha glanced over to the stable wall where two men were stood, one tall and lean, his dark hair curling about his collar, the other shorter and blonde, a wide smile on his young sun-tanned face as he held up a hand in greeting. A gnome did not stop to speak with them though, merely raised a hand as well as he marched smartly past and through the heavy ornate doors of the hall before them. The room he led them into was large, airy, and almost empty, the high narrow windows allowing in a surprising amount of light, while a huge statue of Torm stood at the other end of the hall opposite her, and the cool silence Fritha suddenly found herself in was rather imposing. The floor in the center of the room was sunken down, stout marble columns running about the edge and leaving a raised aisle that ran perimeter of the hall. Fritha followed a gnome as he turned to walk towards the left-hand side, the man drawing to a halt just beside the first pillar. He leaned in slightly, his voice low as he nodded to the paladin who was stood beneath one of the high windows about halfway down, a tall and imposing man of middling years, his lined face stern beneath his dark hair.
"There, my lady, that is Sir Ryan Troll, Knight Commander of the Order and my direct superior."
Fritha nodded, though it seemed they had missed their chance to speak with him, the knight now talking to another older paladin, the man slightly shorter and broader than Troll, his grey hair short and wiry. At her side, she could sense a gnome preparing to wait for them to finish, when the older man glanced up and was suddenly striding across to them, smiling genially.
"Ah, Squire Gnome, I was just speaking of you with Sir Ryan. You are making quite a name for yourself about are you not?"
"My lord," a gnome nodded, raising his hand in formal salute as though he did not know how to reply to such a compliment, and turning quickly to her.
"My lady, may I present Prelate Wes Allen, the head of our order, and Knight Commander Sir Ryan Troll. Sirs, this is Lady Fritha of Candlekeep."
Troll bowed slightly, no change to his impassive expression, but Wes Allen beamed.
"Ah, the Lady Fritha, is it? A pleasure, my dear. Squire Gnome has told us of his time with you so far, and I can see you are indeed deserving of your reputation."
Fritha didn't like to think what a gnome might have said about her lately, she sincerely doubted it would have been anything complimentary.
"Thank you, sir. I beg your pardon, my lord,"
came a small voice at her arm, and she turned with the men to see a pale sandy-haired boy, who looked as though he would have rather been anywhere but there under the gaze of two of the highest-ranking knights within the order.
"Sir Harn awaits you in your office." "Ah, Squire Mark,"
the prelate confirmed genially,
"you have returned from Murin? Good, I expect Harn will have much news of the siege for us. Please go and tell the cook to send us through some tea, and find you something nice while he's at it,"
he added with a friendly smile, and the boy scuttled off, just looking relieved his ordeal was over. Wes Allen sighed.
"Ah well, my duties call. It was most pleasant to make your acquaintance, my lady."
He bowed and kissed her hand.
"Squire Gnome, Sir Ryan."
Fritha watched as he marched unhurriedly down the aisle and disappeared through a plain set of doors at the back of the hall she had not yet noticed.
"Well,"
began Troll, and she quickly turned her attention back to the remaining knight, a gnome at her side and almost rigid in his stance as the man continued.
"I am glad you have come, my lady. There is a matter of a rather sensitive nature in which I believe your group may be able to aid the order, and you will, of course, be well compensated for the task." "We are ready to serve, sir,"
said a gnome gravely, and Troll nodded once, turning slightly towards her.
"You no doubt understand, my lady, the life of a paladin is not easy. Many break under the demands of our path and leave to pursue avenues."
He paused, a slight frown creasing his brow as though he found the idea distasteful.
"More appropriate to their talents,"
he finished eventually.
"Sometimes, though, they bend instead of break, turning their paladinhood to serve their own purposes. These ones are hard to detect, but when found they are quickly cast out.
Fritha blinked at this careless description of cold abandonment, but said nothing. Such groups were known for their severity and she should have expected no less of the order.
Recently one of our highest-ranking knights was implicated in smuggling slaves. His name is Anarg, and though he was once a friend, he was expelled from the order. We thought that the end of it, but he took others with him when he left. Their loss could have been tolerated, but we have recently heard rumors that they are still claiming to be members of the order, using the influence such an association can affect to gain a foothold in and around the Bridge district through extortion and threats.
Troll let his stern gaze travel over them both.
Word has it, they are casting about for allies to help strengthen and expand their position in the city, and your group has enough of a reputation about Athkatla now to make you a desirable ally. I would ask that you approach them, determine the threat they pose and act accordingly. Have you any further questions, my lady?
Fritha shook her head. Though it all sounded simple enough, she could not quell the slight reservations that were squirming within her.
No, sir, I have not.
He nodded once.
Then, I shall bid you both good day. Helm be with you.
Outside, a gnome gazed across the courtyard, warm and familiar under a high sun. His friends, Simon and Eric, were still stood by the stables watching them, the squire as glad to see them as he was to find no sign of the newly knighted Codrel, any meeting with the man sure to pick at his already frayed temper. A gnome felt beyond tired, unable to sleep the night before for dwelling on memories best forgotten. And when he finally had, his dreams were a disturbing jumble of images, worries for his father haunting the only rest he had managed to get. Just as Fritha had predicted, his mind prompted and he was suddenly very aware of the girl stood next to him. A gnome glanced down at her, Fritha looking out over the courtyard as he had been, though he could tell by her slight frown that she was deep in thought, no doubt planning out their next few days in the city. He should not have shouted at her yesterday. Though calling to him in the street was not the most ladylike behavior, his anger had stemmed more from his embarrassment at what Codrel had thought than anything else, and he should not have vented his temper on the girl. And, of course, he had planned to apologize to her the previous evening, his meeting with Oisig and subsequent prayers calming him as nothing else could. But then the girl had not returned from her theatre before he had retired, and that morning had found her never far from Nalia, to the point where he wondered whether Fritha wasn't avoiding him. A gnome sighed slightly. Now the whole affair felt too far past to dredge up again with an apology, for Fritha seemed happy enough to pretend the altercation had never happened, and he himself was reluctant to bring it up and feel his shame anew. A gnome shook his head. He had to let the past go, his transgressions and his worries both, and focus on the future. Sir Ryan Troll had entrusted them with this task, and he would be the one to see it done, a good opportunity to directly serve the order and his knight. At his side, Fritha stirred.
Right, well, I'll go and let the others know our plans, she began, glancing to his friends and smiling slightly. Just join us when you're ready.
He nodded once.
My lady.
She nodded as well, and he watched as she walked across the sunlit courtyard and disappeared through the gatehouse. An instant later Simon was at his side, a broad grin on his round boyish face, while Eric was not long behind him.
Who was that?
A gnome shook himself, half his mind still on his knight's words.
Sorry, oh, that was Fritha. Fritha.
Simon confirmed with incredulous delight.
Your leader.
A gnome gave a curt nod.
Yes, she has afforded me much guidance. She is very capable. Capable.
Simon repeated, staring back at him open-mouthed.
"A gnomon, she's radiant."
Eric laughed heartily, clapping the younger man on the back as Simon continued, shaking his head at a gnomon as though sorry for him.
"You Helmites are all the same, all those thoughts of duty keep your blood cold. We know how to follow our hearts."
He laughed, patting the symbol of Lathander that hung on a cord about his neck.
"Come, a gnomon, our honor as watchers rests upon your shoulders,"
said Eric, a broad smile gracing his sculpted features, but all a gnomon could muster was a frown.
"We are not cold-blooded."
Simon shrugged mildly.
"As you say, but you must introduce me." "I will not. And your attitude does not become a knight of the order." "Then it is fortunate they haven't made me one yet, isn't it?"
He grinned, and before a gnomon could say another word, he had turned smartly on his heel and was heading for the gatehouse. A gnomon took one look at Eric and set off in hasty pursuit.
"Sweet sunrise, there's more of them!"
came a familiar cry from outside the walls, and the pair passed under the gatehouse to find Simon stood just before it, his grey eyes scanning the gathering of people scattered about the paths below.
"Who's the tall one? She is glorious, though slightly fearsome. And the elf is with you as well? Positively angelic. And isn't that Lady Nalia d'Arnis?"
"Simon," a gnomon hissed, but his friend had already been noticed by Erlina.
"Squire Simon, you must come and meet my new acquaintances,"
she called in her clear bright tones, and the man was more than happy to oblige. A gnomon watched as he strolled over to her, being introduced to everyone in turn before joining Nalia and Erlina, the three sharing a brief conversation, glancing over to him and laughing at something Simon said before the man returned to his side, beaming.
"Gods, you have fallen on your feet there and no mistake. The elf, Ari, is very pretty, but a little too obvious, and Lady Nalia is as pleasant as ever she was, but I think my favorite is still Fritha. She has a lovely smile, don't you think?" "I'm sure I haven't noticed,"
said a gnomon sourly. Eric laughed and Simon sighed, the squire suppressing rolling his eyes with some difficulty.
"Well, look on it now then."
A gnomon glanced across to Fritha, who was currently sat on the far wall opposite them and leaning backwards over the canal, Herr Dallas daring her to go further as Ari told him off and wrung her sleeves. Suddenly, Fritha overbalanced with a shriek, her arms flailing, and a gnomon felt himself start forward as the tiefling did, though neither man was required as the girl straightened unaided, laughing merrily at her trick. He turned slowly back to Simon, who was grinning widely.
"The girl is an idiot." "I thought she was capable,"
interjected Eric mildly. Simon laughed.
"She is merely high-spirited, a gnomon, and very nicely it becomes her too. Come now, you should at least be able to see she is fair even if it is beyond you to appreciate it. Even Caudrel thinks so." "Caudrel? What has that braggart got to do with it?"
Simon looked expectantly to Eric, who shrugged.
"Oh, I merely overheard him in the dormitories yesterday, telling his friends about some jewel of a girl he had seen in your company."
A gnomon was almost tempted to ask Eric whether he was sure it had been Fritha, when he suddenly recalled the way Caudrel had stared up at the girl as she had called to him from the window, the incredulity in the man's tone as he had asked if she was his. A gnomon felt a surge of anger. That arrogant braggart didn't think he could win the favor of a lady. And, of course, he thought Fritha was pretty in her own way, she was merely not the sort of girl he usually considered attractive. A gnomon was not inexperienced around women. Indeed, the seminary where he spent his teenage years had been located but a few miles from a small town, and he had had relationships with a couple of the local girls over the years, though there had not really been anyone since he returned to Athkatla and joined the Order's ranks. He thought back to Avelini, the golden-haired young lady whom he had met when he was but 16 winters old. She had been a daughter of one of the local noble families, and they had met when she had visited the seminary with her family to be present as her elder brother was ordained. They had begun a tentative courtship, one of shy looks and stuttered pledges, and appropriate to their youth and inexperience. But she had been sent to stay with her relatives in Athkatla upon her 17th birthday just a year later, more than likely to improve her chances of a good match, though such was never said out loud, and he had not seen her since. And then a year or so later he had met Theta through mutual friends. A gnome felt himself smile absently. He could still recall the way her fine green eyes would shine as she would tell him of her latest service to her god. An acolyte at the nearby temple to Tyr, she was training to be a cleric as he was, and their good-natured rivalry soon blossomed into a more intimate relationship, though it was perhaps based more on a physical attraction than the innocent adoration of his previous courtship, and she had understood when he too returned to the city to pursue his dreams of knighthood, her sense of duty in such matters as strong as his own. But had they been of noble blood or merely possessing of a noble heart, both ladies had held a certain quiet poise, virtuous, dutiful, and nothing like Fritha.
"There is a thoughtful look to your eyes, a gnome,"
teased Simon, smiling broadly. "Could it be you have enjoyed a change of heart?" A gnome sighed tersely.
"Fritha's appearance is of no more concern to me than yours is, Simon. She is my leader just as the others I travel with are my companions and nothing more. I have my gaze firmly set upon the goal of my knighthood, an example you could do with following."
Simon shook his head, looking both amused and exasperated.
"Fine, as you would have it, a gnome. That group is clearly wasted on you. Come on, Eric, let us leave him to the ladies. Farewell, a gnome."
And a gnome watched as his friends disappeared through the gates, the squire turning his attention back to the group before him. Irlina and the other girls were giggling and flushed, and even Zuhara was smiling slightly as Herr Dallas played the wit at the expense of Garrick's resumed attempts at courtship.
"Oh, my fair lady Irlina, hear this poem and try not to weep at the atrocious delivery,"
cut in Herr Dallas with a grin.
"And no,"
continued Garrick impatiently, almost drowned out by their giggling,
my regard for you is undying. My heart is heavy with this love, for which I'll bare my soul to prove. With tender words and honesty. And the ceasing of this travesty."
A gnome snorted in spite of himself, the girls all looking quite pretty as they were lost to laughter once more. Perhaps he appreciated this company more than he had admitted. End of chapter.